Yo, it's Marcus Scripper. So we had an interesting day today with Palantir stock and also the broader market, especially in the S&P 500, a historic day hitting SPY 400, and also the S&P 500 went over 4,000. So we're gonna get all into that right now. But before we get into this video, if you get any value from this content, don't forget to put a smash down on that like button. It really helps this content, helps other people see this video. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel. It's free to do, and I'd really appreciate it. Okay, so Palantir stock today, we opened the day at a pretty high level, which ended up being around the highs of the day. And then we ended up just drifting lower and lower throughout the day. So we did make new highs today. So this is interesting. We made new highs. Was this the end of this run that we were trying to go? It could be, it might not. Just a few interesting points just to pay attention to in terms of we've been talking about where on the downside to pay attention to, but not so much about where on the upside to pay attention to. So this is an interesting line just because we saw resistance the day before, and then also today we weren't able to close above this line. Is this a line that I'm going to be paying close attention to? Not so much. The next line that I'm going to be paying attention to is more of this line here. This would be my next target to the upside if we end up going to the upside. So this, we have to be paying attention to this. Was this the end of this move? This is something we're going to get into a little bit more later on because this has to do with tech and tech's role in pushing the S&P 500 to 4,000 or SPY 400. And was this all that was meant for tech, or is this going to be a more significant move besides just getting the S&P 500 to 4,000 or SPY to 400? So this is the next line that I'm going to be looking at here. And once we break above this, just some additional targets just to pay attention to. We have a few gaps here. We have a gap from, if I'm looking at over here, right over here, between this, we have a gap. We didn't even fill that gap at the high over here. So we have this area that we could go to, and that area we're talking about a price of around $27.50. And then above that, we have a gap up here as well between this, and that's around the next one is $31. So those are the two levels above this line here. And this is what I'm going to be paying attention to. I think that we will find resistance around this line if we break above this. Again, testing the highs over here, get to that gap right above it, and then after that, filling the gap over here. And when will this happen? I'm not so bullish on Palantir in the medium term. I was very bullish on Palantir in the very short term because I saw this reversal in tech, but in the medium term, I actually don't really know what to think about Palantir. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm just accumulating shares for the long term because my view on Palantir in the long term is extremely bullish. Okay, so let's take a look at what has happened with the S&P 500. So if we look at here, I talked about this flag pattern that was happening here, a bullish flag pattern, and I was expecting a rise to at least 4,000 in the S&P 500 or SPY 400. And so we had an interesting battle to get to 400, and we finally got to 400 at the end of the day and ended up breaking a little bit above 400, and we're still running a little bit up after hours, as we can see over here. So that is pretty encouraging and pretty exciting that we reached our target. And what's going to happen next? So the few things that I'm just seeing off the bat that would be my initial expectation, and this is kind of in line with a few other things in terms of what happened when SPY initially went to 300 and then also initially went to 200. Both times we had a little bit of a correction, and a very minor one before going above 400 or above the 300 and above 200, and then having a significant pullback. Now, I also want to play the devil's advocate because when I'm looking at this, the obvious play that I'm seeing here is that, yes, it's going to play out exactly like 300 and 200 because we're going to go fill this gap that we made here today. And this is a gap that I think will be filled. Now, when will this be filled? I'm not exactly sure, but this is a gap that I think will be filled at some time. And my immediate bias right now is that it will be filled pretty soon. Whether it is tomorrow, the next day, or in the next 2 weeks, I think this is going to happen pretty soon. Now, I did a little bit more digging though, and there is evidence that could counter what I'm looking at right here. And the evidence that's counter, and what are we looking at right here? This is the S&P 500, this is the SPY, and this is when we first broke 100 for the first time, right over here. So we first broke 100 actually right here. We gapped up to break 100. This was pretty interesting. And why is this interesting? This is interesting because we had this rally and a struggle to get to 100 initially. We tried to get to 100 here, failed. Tried to get to 100 again, failed. And if we look back over here, And we just zoom out a little bit. We tried basically to get to 400 over here, failed. We tried to get to 400 again and failed. And so you can see here, the time that we finally got to 400, we had a gap up and we had a gap up and get to 400. Now, this is just interesting because if we look at here, the first time we were able to get to 100, we had to gap up and we finally got to 100. And then did we actually turn around and fill this gap? Well, we eventually did over here, but we didn't do that for a very long time. We just went up and did not look back. So this is just something to be aware of. This is another thing to be aware of because we were looking at 200, we were looking at 300, and if we followed that rhyme and reason of 200 and 300, what we would expect in that scenario is we expect just a brief dip, maybe fill the gap here, go back up, maybe go over 400 by a dollar or two or three, and then have a significant correction before going higher. So that is the playbook of 200 and 300, those psychological numbers of the SPY, but also we have to keep in mind what happened when we initially went to 100 for the first time. And again, we made this gap here and didn't look back and didn't fill it for a quite a long time. And this is definitely something that can happen. So I'm just looking at this and I want to be aware of this possible scenario. My bias is that we see this gap filled sooner than later, but now seeing 100 and what happened in the past here, this is a scenario that we at least have to be aware of. Now, what happened with tech? We talked about Apple yesterday, and we talked about we hit this 150-day moving average, and we thought, were we either rejected here, or since we pierced through this, maybe we gap above this tomorrow. And that's exactly what we did. We gapped above the 150-day moving average, and we ended up closing right on it, maybe right above the 150-day moving period. So this is on face value somewhat bullish, and we kind of expect this to maybe continue to the upside and have the 150-day moving average now act as resistance because this is the weekly close, and so we closed above the 150-day moving average. So that's very encouraging. Now there are a few interesting things just to consider here. We have Tesla also. Tesla also went up pretty significantly, and we can see here that we are running into some lines of resistance here. So we have to be aware of the resistant lines that we're starting to hit here. We see that we're running into resistance right here. Now this is the pattern that could be forming here, this kind of triangle from the base here and the top over here, and we could be bouncing around here for a little bit longer. Maybe we gap above this on the next trading day. So these are all definitely possibilities. But the other thing just to consider is this idea that was tech really needed for this rally? I think yes. My hypothesis is that tech was going to be needed. We saw Apple having this pretty massive run for Apple, and we saw Tesla having an incredible run. So tech definitely was the help in terms of the wind behind the sails to get the S&P 500 to 4,000 or SPY to 400. Now the question is this. Was that their mission? Are they a one and done? Or is there something more meaningful happening with the tech sector in terms of a recovery? So this is the question which I don't have an answer to at the moment, whether tech was just being used to get to 400 or whether tech is actually having a turnaround and a recovery. Because I mentioned with Palantir stock that I'm expecting a rally, and I was expecting a rally more than just where we went to so far. And again, we went a little bit higher again, but we unfortunately closed below the high yesterday. So we could be done. This is something that we have to be aware of. Just the fact that the S&P 500 had this run to 400. If we are in this scenario where we're going a lot higher, I think that tech is actually going to be turning around. And tech is needed to push and to continue to push to the upside. And I think this is a real possibility because, again, we have this example of what happened at SPY 100. We kept going up here. We had some of this consolidation right over here. And this is something that I think is kind of similar to what's going on right now. Will this actually happen and play out? I don't actually know because my bias before, and is kind of still my bias, is that we'll have this little dip, we'll have a normal psychological number here, and then finally break out a little bit more, but then again get rejected and have a significant pullback. That's kind of what I'm thinking would happen. But now seeing this here, looking at what's happening with tech, and if tech is actually having an actual reversal, a meaningful reversal, and not just a bounce, this could be in store for the near future. It just needs to be something that we're aware of. It's something that we're seeing in Apple. Apple is giving us a signal that maybe this is a little bit more meaningful. If this was not as meaningful, why not close below the 150-day moving average, which again, it's acting as support, so it's understandably that we might have closed above it, but this could be a hint at least that maybe there's something more significant going on here. Maybe it's a start of an actual breakout and that tech is going to be on an actual recovery instead of just a bounce to get the SPY to 400. Well, I hope you guys got some value from this content. If you haven't already, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel for more content like this, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. And keep in mind that none of this is financial advice. This is just some random guy on YouTube drawing some stick figure lines on a chart talking to you guys.